Welcome to The Explainer. So today we're going to dive into some fascinating research from Dr. Sudheendra S G to unpack a really big question, especially for all you mass communications students out there. We've all settled in for a 2-hour movie, right? But have you ever stopped to wonder,
Seriously, how did we go from these tiny 50-second clips of a train pulling into a station to these huge, sprawling epics we have today? It seems like a massive, impossible jump. Well, it turns out that journey from a simple little novelty to a powerful narrative art form, it wasn't an accident. It was a full-blown revolution.
Just look at this timeline. Think about the sheer ambition here. In just 20 years, the average runtime for a film just exploded. It went from a quick little peek at something to an entire evening's entertainment. So what on earth happened in those 2 decades that made such a radical change even possible?
To get it, we're going to break this whole evolution down into 5 key stages. We'll start with the nuts and bolts, the industrial machine. Then we'll get into the rebellion that broke it, the revolution and how long a movie could be, the controversial genius who basically wrote the grammar of film, and finally, why this new, longer format became the standard all over the world. Okay, first up, the industrial backbone of cinema. See, before you can tell a long, complicated story, you need a system, a machine in place to actually produce, promote, and show it. You need what we call a pipeline.
So as movies just blew up in popularity, this really slick 3-step system started to form. First, you had the studio, right? That's where the movie gets made. Then comes the distributor. They're the ones who market the film and get it booked into theaters. And finally, you got the exhibitor, which is just the theater itself, showing it to all of us. This whole machine completely standardized how films were made, moved, and, most importantly, how they made money.
And this led to something called vertical integration. It's a fancy term for a simple idea. One company owning everything: the studio, the distribution, and the theaters. Now, this gave them an incredible amount of control, but it also created a massive problem. It basically killed competition and new ideas. And as this whole system was getting built in the US, a very similar structure was taking shape over in India. Companies like Madan Theatres in Calcutta were building their own powerful networks, and studios like Probat and Bombay Talkies. They weren't just making movies, they were actively shaping the theater circuits where those movies would even be seen. It's such a critical lesson. The business pipeline was every bit as important as the pictures on the screen.
All right, so you have this standardized, super-controlled system. And what happens when you have that much control? Well, you get a monopoly. And that monopoly, kind of ironically, is what sparked the rebellion that would change movies forever.
In the US, this monopoly was called the Motion Picture Patents Company, but everybody just called it the Trust. It was basically built around Thomas Edison's patents, and this group controlled literally everything. What cameras you could use, what kind of stories you could tell, even whether you could buy the raw film to shoot on. They were the ultimate gatekeepers for the entire American film industry.
And you can imagine, this incredible pressure forced independent filmmakers to fight back. They had to rebel. So they fled the Trust's home base in New Jersey and headed way out west. They were looking for sunshine, sure, but more than anything, they were looking for freedom from that monopoly. And this mass exodus to a quiet little suburb called Hollywood is exactly what broke the Trust's grip, and it created the space for filmmakers to finally take bigger, riskier, and longer bets.
Okay, so the Trust's power was starting to crack. The next big wall that had to come down was this simple but really powerful belief that audiences just didn't have the attention span for anything more than a 10-minute movie.
And here's the really crucial part. This 10-minute limit wasn't because of what audiences wanted. No way. It was a totally artificial cap set by the Trust. They basically said films could only be one reel long, which is about 10 to 16 minutes. In their view, movies were just a quick little novelty act, not the main event.
But then, the foreign invasion happened. These huge, multi-reel historical epics started coming in from Europe, films like The Loves of Queen Elizabeth and Quo Vadis. And they were massive hits in America. They proved without a shadow of a doubt that audiences were starving for longer, more involved stories. The market was absolutely ready for a main attraction.
And right at the very same time this revolution was happening in the West, the year 1913 became this huge turning point in India. This was the moment that the subcontinent's own totally unique cinematic identity really started to form. So, in 1913, Dada Saheb Phalke released Raja Harishchandra, which was India's very first full-length feature film. He was so smart.
He used this grand, mythic story that was specifically designed to keep an audience captivated. Fast forward less than 2 decades, and Ardashir Irani's Alam Ara introduces sound, dialogue, and song, completely rewiring audience expectations and creating that all-singing, all-dancing spectacle that would become a true hallmark of Indian cinema.
So, films are getting longer. Awesome. But, a long movie with no real structure is, well, it's just boring. Now that movies could be long, they desperately needed a visual language to tell these complex stories and actually keep people glued to their seats. And this is where the director, D.W. Griffith, steps onto the scene. By making hundreds and hundreds of short films, he basically invented the modern language of cinema. He used close-ups to show us what a character was feeling, insert shots to highlight important objects, flashbacks to play with time, and this amazing technique called cross-cutting to build incredible suspense. These weren't just moving pictures anymore, they were emotionally moving experiences.
And then, 1915 happened. Griffith took his entire toolkit and poured it into one gigantic film. It would prove the commercial power of the feature film once and for all, but it would also cement a deeply, deeply toxic legacy.
Yeah, this brings us to the really complicated and difficult legacy of The Birth of a Nation. Look, on one hand, it was technically brilliant, a masterpiece of the new film grammar. It was a monster at the box office and proved that future films were the future. But on the other hand, and this is a huge but, its story was a moral catastrophe. It was a violently racist piece of propaganda that glorified the Ku Klux Klan. You simply cannot separate the two. Its technical brilliance and its moral bankruptcy are forever tangled up together in film history.
Now, back in India, filmmakers saw the power of this new cinematic language, and masters like V. Shantaram, Bimal Roy, and Guru Dutt brilliantly adapted the toolkit, the close-ups, the editing styles, but they used them for their own powerful stories of melodrama and social critique. They adopted the craft, but absolutely not the racist creed. And they even invented their own unique narrative tools, like the song sequence, to tell distinctly Indian stories.
So, let's recap. We have the industrial pipeline in place, we have an audience that's hungry for longer stories, and we have a new visual grammar to tell them. With all those pieces on the board, the feature film became the undisputed king of the cinema. And when you really think about it, the feature film format just worked. It was a perfect fit for everyone. For the industry, you could market one single, huge event. For theaters, you could build your entire schedule around a headliner. For filmmakers, you finally had a big enough canvas to develop complex characters. And for us, the audience, we could get a complete, emotionally satisfying experience. It was a win-win-win-win. And in India, this whole evolution took on its own amazing flavor. The combination of that feature length with musical numbers gave birth to the iconic masala film. This incredible format that could blend action, romance, comedy, and drama all into one fantastic story. I mean, from classics like Sholay all the way to modern blockbusters like Bahubali, this is the template that has defined so much of popular Indian cinema.
So in the end, the feature film was never an accident. It was a hard-won victory, a synthesis of industry, art, and audience demand that was built, fought for, and perfected over 2 chaotic and brilliant decades. Which, of course, leaves us with one final, pretty critical question for today. In our age of endless streaming and 15-second videos, what is the future of the feature film?